Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for a discussion with Shirley DicKard in honor of Women's History Month. Before we get started with our program, we should take a moment to acknowledge that this virtual program is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. A land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnerships and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are all collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have sown worldwide. Yolo County is on the traditional unceded territory of the Yochidehe Wintu Nation. So before we start, I did also want to let you guys know that at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat button and also a Q&A button. We feel free to utilize either throughout the presentation. We'll try to address as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And we also like the little notes that you leave in the chat. So feel free. I'll try to check both if you forget and put your question into the chat, but I will try to focus mostly on the Q&A section at the end. So I want to get started by thanking Shirley for joining us this afternoon, and we're going to give her a little introduction. So Shirley DicKard is the great-granddaughter of Emily Hoppin and a fourth-generation Californian. Both sides of her family came to California with the gold rush in 1849. She grew up near Sacramento and first attended UC Davis, then got her BS in nursing at the UC Medical Center in San Francisco. As a nurse, she has worked primarily with women, children, and community health. Shirley is now retired and living in the Sierra, 2 hours east of Woodland, on the small homestead she and her husband built as part of the Back to the Land movement in the 1970s. Emily Hoppin was the inspiration for her first novel, Heartwood, For Women, For the Earth, For the Future, which has just been named a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Montaigne Medal, which is awarded to the most thought-provoking books. So we're excited about that. And then lastly, before we get started with our discussion, I did want to acknowledge that there are some other descendants of Emily Hoppin joining us today on this presentation. So sorry if I missed anybody, but these are the people I spotted in the attendee list. So I'll check again when, before we end the discussion. But Mariah Lander, Crystal Sevier, Nancy Peters, Jim Moffitt, Miriam Berg, and Kathy Altavilla. So thank you so much for attending. And let's get started. So first of all, Shirley, can you start off by telling us how you became interested in Emily Hoppin's history? So aside from the fact that she was your great-grandmother, what was the catalyst for learning more about her? And then maybe this is an opportunity for you to talk a little bit about your book as well.
Okay, so I'm going to switch over to, okay, this is all kind of new technology. So if something's not working, you can't see, just, raise your hand for Heather. Okay, well, thank you. And first of all, I want to thank the Yolo County Library and Archives for this opportunity to share the Emily Hoppin that I have come to know in this process. And also to the Campbellville Historical Society for letting me use this history room in the Campbellville Community Center, where the internet connection is so much better than in our home in the mountains. So anyway, all of us cousins, those of you who are out there remember, we all grew up hearing stories about from our grandmother, telling stories about her mother, Emily Hoppin. And back in the 1980s, with the rise of feminism and women growing into power, Emily became quite a family legend, and I think sort of the family matriarch in our family. So this is our grandmother and Emily's youngest daughter, Dorothea. We called her Grandma Dot Dot. She was a change of life baby. Emily had already had her family. She had 4 children, ages 11 to 18, and now she had a baby. So according to Grandma, her mother cried every day of her pregnancy. But Grandma Dot Dot right now is reading, in this picture, reading one of the first Ms. magazines that came out in the 1970s. And you can see Bette Midler on the cover there. She was fascinated with what women were doing nowadays. Grandma Dot Dot was also a great storyteller. So from my grandma's stories, my earliest impressions of my great-grandmother Emily was that she was a farm woman, a prohibitionist, and a club woman, whatever that was, because I didn't know. My mother was a club woman. She belonged to bridge clubs and dancing clubs, so I figured it was something like that. Those were all huge understatements, as I was defined. So in 1976, when Grandma was 81 years old, my sister Emily, Emily Hoppin's namesake, and I sat down with a tape recorder and we interviewed Grandma so that we wouldn't lose all of her stories. I transcribed them into an oral history book called The Home Place, which I give a copy to the archives, and it's now posted on my website so everybody can read it. So I continued on with my casual research in the 1980s and 90s, and when I was given her scrapbook. So with all this research, my original intent was to write a biography of Emily. But then I began asking, what's the larger context of her life? I mean, she wasn't a big woman like Stanton and Sanger and Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman. She wasn't like to the top of the list that you'd find in history books, but she also did a lot of really important work in her time. So how does what she did relate to us today was one of my questions. So I decided I'd write a book contrasting her life with mine, because we're both kind of back to the Landers. Then one night, about 3 a.m, I was visited by the future when an apparition of my great-granddaughter, Amisha, stood at the foot of my bed. Now, of course, she's not born yet. She's just out in the future someplace. And she said that if I'm going to write about the past and the present, then I must include the future, because everything we're doing today and in the past, and everything we're not doing, has been creating the world that she is living in. And she was asking for help. So at that point, I woke up and I knew that I had a whole nother book. And Heartwood became the legacy of the ancient woman Shema'a, who saw the earth's demise at the hands of men, sent her warning and message of hope forward in time within the heart of an acorn. I wove the stories of 3 family women from the past, present, and future, who were mysteriously connected by the old family desk they inherit. But great-grandma Emily was the seed of all this.
That's great. It's so interesting to see how your family could influence this fictional story that's woven through all of these generations of women. So as the archivist in the room, I was hoping you could also talk about the types of primary sources that you used in your research and the different libraries and repositories that you visited in your search for more information.
Sure. Okay. Well, my research mainly consisted of family sources, internet research, and then site visits. So for the family sources, I had our great-grandfather, Charles Rossiter Hoppin, who was Emily's husband before she met him. His letters home when he first came out to California in the gold rush. So 1849 to 1863, they've all been transcribed. And then I have the oral history book that I told you about of Dorothea's memories of growing up on the ranch and of her mother. Lots of family stories. And then the other thing is Emily's personal scrapbook, which I will be talking more about coming up, and I'll show you lots of the pages out of it. I also had a conversation, which I just found the notes, with Virginia Hoppin Johnson way back in 1991. She was Emily's niece, and she actually knew her. So I got some firsthand impressions of Emily, which were kind of interesting. Internet research, mainly Google searches and digital newspaper collections. And of course, back in the 1990s, hardly anything existed. But now there is an explosion of digitalized information, and it's been wonderful. It's been like a gold mine. The last time I checked, there were 240 references to Emily Hoppin and Yolo. Some of them were just small little things. Emily Hoppin attended this meeting, or Emily was elected treasurer or something very small, but some of them were her speeches and articles about her. The article on the right, the new executive in Feminine Clubdom, I really recommend that as a chance to get to see the inside workings of Emily Hoppin as she was interviewed. So that's on my website. And then site visits. Okay, of course, I went to the Yolo County Historical Archives. I've been going there since the 1980s when it was just a small unit in a warehouse. And now it has grown into almost a full warehouse. And it's called the Shipley Walters Center. And Shipley is an amazing historian of Yolo County. And I have referenced many of her writings in her books. So much appreciation to the work that she has done. And on the bottom left is Heather scanning Emily's fragile scrapbook for me. So they will make a digital copy available through the Yolo archives that everybody can see. It's too big for me to put on my website, but I have pages out of it. On the far right is the Gibson House Historical Museum in Woodland, and I visited many times, took photos of the rooms for kind of settings. And then in the middle, the top one, we went to Nevada to fill in some mysterious gaps in her story. This is the historic record room in the recorder's office of Humboldt County, Nevada, which is in Winnemucca. And I can still smell the old ledgers there and going through and actually finding the name Hoppin in some of the land transfers. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then the bottom is the California Trail Interpretive Center in Elko. This is an amazing experience to actually feel what it's like to be on the California Trail. I highly recommend that museum. I've been there, Interpretive Center, I should say. I've been there many times. So there's something about the smell and actually touching historical objects, the texture, the color, the feel. It's like almost like a molecular connection to the past. Each piece filled a piece of the puzzle. And of course, my dream now is to find some of Emily's personal letters or journals so I can get more of a sense of how she thought and how she felt about what was going on. So.
Yes, it's so great that you're able to not only visit some of these repositories, but also have access to so many more items with this push for digitization. And I think from the archivist perspective, not only does it improve access, but it also helps with the preservation component for some of those materials. A little bit less touching, but like you were saying, I think touching the real thing, there really is no substitute for that. But it is great that it's been improving access as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about Emily's background and how she came to Yolo County and what life was like for her and her family while she was here?
Sure. Okay, her early years were fairly straightforward. She was born in 1854 in Niles, Michigan. Her parents were Nathaniel Bacon. He was a judge of the Michigan Supreme and Circuit Courts. Her mother, Carolyn Lord Bacon, was very well read and traveled and was always a friend to those in need. Her father insisted that she get a good education. He sent her to the Michigan Female Seminary in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and it was a 4-year course. And in the middle, you can see the courses of study. You can't actually read them, I'm sure, but it's a classic education in those days. Ancient and modern languages, history, poetic works, rhetoric, composition, lots of math and lots of science classes. I was impressed. So when she graduated, she took up a teaching position in the high school at Niles, Michigan. And you kind of fast forward to 1915, the San Francisco Chronicle described Emily as one of the most brilliant women in the state, able to speak on any subject that may be presented. And you can just see with that education as a background, you can understand why that would be. So there's a family story that all of us cousins have some version of this, and it's one of my favorites. When Emily was just an infant, the Bacon family was visited by an old family friend named Charles Hoppin, who had immigrated to California during the gold rush. As this 27-year-old man held baby Emily, he said to her parents, "I'll wait for her." And that's exactly what he did. 20 years later, after living in California for 20 more years, he came back and asked her to marry him. She was 20 years old and he was 47. So in 1874, she married and left everything for California. So those are the facts, but really, I would love to know her thinking. I would love to know how she felt about leaving all the women friends, leaving her parents, leaving her teaching position, and everything she knew to go to California with this older man she hardly knew. So in writing a fictionalized version of her story, I was able to get into her skin and imagine some of these. So as she settled into her life on the farm, there's not a lot recorded, but between 1974 and 1895, she raised 5 children: Harriet, Edward, Edith, Charles, and Dorothea. So Charles and Emily divided up the responsibilities of the farm. He took care of the ranch, the crops, and the animals, and Emily took care of the household. So according to Dorothea in her oral history, I did a compilation of her mother's typical workday. And these are all in the oral history book. And they may be a little small to read, I can't quite tell. But of particular note to me is that she would wake up at 5 in the morning or earlier if she had to get her butter and fryers on the 6 a.m. train for the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, because they would buy everything that she could produce. And then the other thing that I particularly note in her schedule is from 1:30 to 5, she worked at her desk. And I like that because she was quite a very prolific writer. So I'm glad she carved out that time that was like only for her for writing. Then in the oral history book, there's lots of stories, and I'm not going to read them all, but there was stories about sort of like a Foxfire version. There's food preparation, politics, farmhands, like Slim, Shorty, Tom, the Gorman boys, the remittance men. They lived at the farm or at Uncle Chris's working man's hotel in Woodland. So that was kind of her middle years that were kind of not too well documented, but enough.
Yeah, it's so great that you have some documentation about that daily schedule, because it shows just how much work goes into running a farm in those days, and also how important her work was to her, that she created that time that you called out, that she set aside specifically for her writing and things like that. So as you know, many women's stories from our past haven't been documented very well. So I would love to take this opportunity to have you highlight some of the ways in which Emily made her mark on Yolo County and California while she was alive.
Okay, I just hit something.
We do see your slide, Shirley.
Okay. I'm almost back to where I need to be. Hold on. I love this. It's like this is added. This zooming has added like 5 years to my brain health, I swear. It's good. Okay. So I did the daily life. Okay, now we're back to how she made her mark. Okay.
Yes.
So we have a scrapbook here. This is a typical page on the scrapbook that Heather scanned. And the scrapbook, if you go through beginning to end, it kind of shows her progression. At the beginning, like many women, like even today, she was mainly focused, I think, on home and children. And maybe she was active in children's schools or developing parks or things like that, but it's pretty home focused. Then the first third was filled with sentimental prose and poetry, like you're seeing here. The poetry was about children and motherhood, nature and death, things like that. But then we get this little hint on the right-hand side. There's a picture of Dolores Spencer, who was the secretary of the WCTU. And so it's like, aha, okay, got something new going on here. The last 2/3 of her scrapbook were more articles and speeches and everything about the WCTU, also the California Federation of Women's Clubs, obituaries, and then long printouts of her speeches and papers, most of them laced with quotations and poetry. So let's get into some of the stuff that she did. Okay, she helped form the Yolo County WCTU in 1887. There were smaller groups before, but she consolidated them into the Yolo County, and she was the president for 3 years. And it's an interesting chapter because at the turn of the century, of according to Yolo Woodland history, there were 40 saloons in Woodland. And think of that, there are 20 on one street alone. Now think about if there were 40 Starbucks in a town of 3,000, a little bit more than 3,000, which is the population of Woodland in 1910. 40 Starbucks, 40 saloons, it was quite an influence. This is where the politics were decided. Great-grandma always rallied about the saloon vote, and where the men spent their earnings. And of course, when they came home, the women lost out physically and emotionally. Now, Emily, even though she was against alcohol, it didn't stop her from protecting her workers when they were shortchanged. So I'm going to read a little story from the oral history book. It's one of my favorite ones. It gives some about great-grandma Emily. See if I can manage this. Okay, so the men would ring the bell for everything. I remember they rang the bell and I went out and they said they wanted to talk to Mrs. Hoppin. Mother said, well, what in the world? So she went out, and of course she was big and she got tired. So she was sitting on the edge of the woodbox. Of course, I sneaked into the pantry and I pulled the sliding door a little bit so I could hear. My brothers and sisters were right behind me and we were listening. It seems the local woman in the hotel was overcharging the men. They had $20 gold pieces, which I think were the size of $1. And then there were $5 gold pieces, size of a nickel or a dime. So the men would give her a $20 gold piece. And Vernie, this woman who operated the saloon, she'd say, you gave me $1 and give them change for $1. So the men knew that some of them were getting cheated and they were getting madder by the minute. They told my mother about it. And of course, mother said, that was a very grave charge to make. So she said, a couple of you will have to stay sober or be sick or be something, but you stay sober and make a note of the time everything happens. So they watched and they kept track of how the women shortchanged the men. So then my mother went down and she sent word for Vernie to come out and told her that she was wise to the fact that she was shortchanging her men. If she heard another complaint, she would see to it that she was out of business. And then my sister and I asked, so this was even though she was very active in the WCTU, she was still concerned they got their money's worth of alcohol? And Grandma said, well, she wasn't going to have her men cheated. They were going to get their money's worth, period. And she saw to it that they did. The men among themselves, they thought, well, you work for your old lady and you don't get cheated. You work for so-and-so and you do. How come? On that, I don't know all the gory details, but I can surmise why. So I'm sure my cousins have heard that story before. The supervisor's agenda, thanks to the persistent WCTU women. They always brought it up on the agenda. And the men were getting a little tired of it, but they always, they had to respond to it. So I'm going to read, this is the article on the right side of the screen. And it's a printout from the newspaper. And this is where both Mr. and Mrs. Hoppin speak to the Board of Supervisors. So Charles Hoppin, this happened somewhere before 1903. So I'm not sure, there's no date on the paper. Charles Hoppin was the first to speak to address the board and somewhat surprised the audience by making an able and even eloquent speech. I imagine his wife had something to do with that. He dwelt upon the temptation of the saloons, especially the boys. He said the only reason why he had refused to buy a lot and move his family into Woodland was that there was too great a saloon influence, and there were 100 other such cases. He spoke of and denounced the saloon influence in politics, which was so great that a man could not be elected to office unless he pandered to the saloons. Said he, the last election, the Washington Young Men's Club, and Washington is now called West Sacramento. They came over from that town and offered their votes to the highest bidder. My party leaders bid on them, and so did the other side. Well, the other side had a bank, and they got them. He implored the board not to ignore the question because it had been headed up by women, and related historical facts to show that women had led some of the greatest reforms in the annals of history. He devoted a share of attention to Messrs. Baker and Clark, the attorneys for the saloon men, and gave them a few deep cuts. He alluded in ironical terms to Baker's advice upon raising children when he advised the WCTU ladies to appoint a committee to go to Mr. Baker's house and to study his system of training children. And then the editor cut in and said, for the benefit of those who are not acquainted with Mr. Baker, we will state that his genealogical tree has not yet put forth any branches. So then Emily Hoppin followed right after him, and she presented a petition of 700 mothers of Yolo County, but she said it was only 700 because they hadn't been able to canvass outside of Woodland yet. So that was both of them. I liked their partnership. I liked that they were all on the same page. They felt similarly and they were supporting each other. Says a lot about him, I think. So Grandma was also, great-grandma, Emily, was also known as one of the Three Musketeers. The Three Musketeers were Lydia Lawhead, who is the vice principal of Woodland High School, Sally Houston, who published The Home Alliance, and Emily Hoppin. And they were a formidable group of women. Also this is my last story of this section, but from Emily's oral history, she wrote about how John Huckey, who was the owner of the Bucket of Blood, they called it because there were so many fights there, but he came to Emily's funeral, and Dorothea was very upset that her nemesis, would come to her funeral. And he said, speaking to her about Emily and the Three Musketeers, he said, that's the trouble with the world today. No people with principles. Those old ladies had principles. He said, listen, when I did something wrong, those old ladies, when I did something wrong, I knew that she'd come. And when that horse was outside of my saloon, everyone in town knew I was in trouble. Evidently, the old ladies kept him pure. When they threatened him and said, if you don't mend your ways, we'll put you out of business, they had the power to do it. So what happened, as history goes, is that once the women got the right to vote in California in 1911, things finally changed, okay? 400 women signed up to vote, registered to vote, and they unanimously tipped the scales, 700 to 425, to close down the saloons in Woodland. So I say no wonder the men didn't want the women to have the franchise, right? Okay, so here's another chapter, another phase of her life. Charles was 27 years older than her, and they knew that he would probably go first. So they decided that she would not be a helpless widow, that she would learn to run the farm. So for the next year, she was in training as he taught her everything she needed to know about running an 800-acre farm. After his death in 1903, she was 49 years old. She blossomed into the community work, the WCTU, the California Federation of Women's Clubs, board president of the Rochdale Company. I'm not sure what that is. I think it's maybe a creamery. The articles on the far right circled, as well as running a highly successful farm. And her niece, Virginia, related this little story. She said, farmers had a cycle, where periodically you have to go to the bank in order to get a loan, and then you pay it back when the crops come in. And she said when Emily needed a loan, she would march into the bank, ask for Mr. Bush, sit down with him and tell him exactly how she wanted to do business with the bank. That was the kind of woman she was. She was also a very respected farm woman. She was very passionate about country life, especially about getting women into farming. She wrote many papers and speeches for the California Fruit Growers Association and the Woodlands Farmers Institute, often detailing how women could start up their own farms. Why not? Even invited women to come live with her to learn more. Here's a sample of the speeches that I have posted on my website under historical research. These are some of the ones I discovered that she wrote. Country life, literature of the farm, can women succeed in horticulture? Women as farmers, diversified farming, 25 acres enough, and the farm that pays. You can read them all on my website. She also advocated for diversified farming and water-saving practices that we could probably use nowadays with the drought. Dry farming, growing raisins, fruit trees without irrigation, intercropping, and so forth. And almost all of her speeches, this is one thing that impressed me, almost all of her speeches had a lyrical quality to them. And here's a little sample from the speech on the country life delivered to the state fruit growers convention. You can imagine these are all pretty much men, of course. 1914. There will always be in my mind the picture of those beautiful mornings when the earth was just awakening from her night's sleep, when the clouds lay in long white bars across her breast, when in the distance the snowy Sierras showed white and crimson and gold, and the rays of the morning sun touched their summits. They were mornings to remember. On the left is the opening address to the California State Fruit Growers Convention in 1914. It's one of my favorite speeches. It's called The Literature of the Farm. And she opened up their convention with this speech. And I don't know if they asked her to write about literature of the farm, but this is what she told them. And here are some recommendations. I just pulled them out of this speech about the books, the literature that one should have on a farm. She said that every home needs some books in sight, just as sometimes we need our friends in sight. She suggested 2 books as a nucleus for a farm library, Shakespeare and the Bible. She said, and make them small versions that you can hold and carry around. Then there was Dickens, Hawthorne, Thoreau, John Muir, Burroughs, Burns, lots of children's books and more. She said, have at least one good magazine devoted to synopses of current events, also a farm paper, a city paper, and then your town paper. The Bible says that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Well, prefix the words, she said, as a man readeth in his newspaper, so thinketh he. So she said to try to find a daily newspaper, if you can, that devotes 2/3 to good things and 1/3 to bad things. And I like this quote, do not be afraid to show hospitality to new ideas. Remember that the radical of the today is a conservative of tomorrow. And then last, remember that books, like friends, can stand a good light, the open fire in the winter, the piazza in the summer, and in the evening, a clear shaded lamp. Okay, so there's a lot in her scrapbook, so I'm just going to keep going here. So further, we start to see clippings of the California Federation of Women's Clubs. This is organized in 1900 and is active today. And I've been in communication with some of the women that are still doing the good work. But since women could not vote in California till 1911, and of course nationwide 1920, the California Federation of Women's Clubs is one of the very few places that women had power, especially collective power to make their world a better place. Emily held various offices and spoke for a wide range of issues, such as women's suffrage and temperance. She spoke up for immigrants, for girls' physical education, because only boys had physical education in schools. She was against the 8-hour workday law. She said it wasn't workable for farmers. They don't work on 8-hour days. And then she gave a delightful speech for 4th of July called Our Four Mothers, which is on the website. So in 1915, it started a whole new chapter in her life. Without the news clippings in her scrapbook, this chapter might have been missing in her life and certainly of the federations. And it's just really, really interesting. The San Francisco newspaper wrote about the elections that never in the history of club women's elections was there such a contest as is waged today for Mrs. Jones of Oroville and Mrs. Emily Hoppin of Yolo for the state presidency. So what happened was, and if there's anybody in the California Federation that wants to correct me, please do, but from as best I can figure out, the president went from the north to the south and south to the north every 2 years. So the North state assumed that Jones would be the logical candidate from the North. But in Woodland, they unexpectedly put up an alternative candidate, Emily Hoppin, to represent the countrywoman. And I suspect, I haven't verified this, but I think it's the Shakespeare Club of Woodland that put her name up. So that caused quite a furor. It's like, oh no, this, we don't do this. And yet they did. And somebody even put up a third candidate. So then there are all these articles about her and about, the qualities of each of the women. And what was written about Emily Hoppin was that she represented the rural woman. She was an elder. She was 60 years old. She was eloquent, articulate, charismatic, organized. She had the capacity to do a lot of things well at one time. She was visionary, brilliant, and kind, and on and on and on. The San Francisco News columnist Ann Wild wrote that of the election, she said, well, the situation appears to be that the state federation may have the choice of the brilliant mind of Mrs. Hoppin, or the grace and charm of Mrs. Jones, or the beauty and clothes of Mrs. Seymour. Well, in a huge upset, she won. The countrywoman won, and the brilliant mind won, I should say. So she promptly got to work. And that was mid-May 1915. So Emily finally had the power. She was at the top, had the power to put her vision into action and to actually work. And she worked tirelessly. She started by appointing the best women that she could find for all the different cabinets in the Federation. And she said she felt like the US president filling his federal cabinets. She was so serious about what she was doing. She set up her 2-year agenda. Then on July 30th, she gave a speech to the Fruit Growers Association in Palo Alto, and then on to her first Federation board meeting in San Francisco. Well, on the train home, she started feeling ill. Dorothy and the family met her at the train station and quickly whisked her home. Dorothy described in the oral history, she described the next days, saying it felt like it was as real as yesterday. In Heartwood, I've tried to be true to these events that followed. Once they got Emily home, they called Dr. Lawhead and sent for a nurse from Sacramento. Emily was suffering from exhaustion and was unable to breathe. She was on strict bed rest and not allowed to write or even dictate to her clubwomen, which frustrated her immensely. After 4 days of failing health, Emily asked, "Is this death? Then it is all right." Contrary to her desire, she was taken by ambulance to Woodland Hospital, where she died August 4, 1915, of heart failure caused by exhaustion, only 2 months into office. As the Home Alliance said, she was permitted to die in the harness. And in Heartwood, my book, I let her die at home, which is where she really wanted to be. So her daughter Dorothy pasted the obituary news clips into Emily's scrapbooks. It's filled with it at the end. And the internet searches revealed vast amounts of shock-filled tributes to her from all over the state and all the way up into Oregon. And I want to read just a small section of what I did in my book, Heartwood. This, of course, is historical fiction. But what I did was, her name is Eliza in the book. And after she died, and we're talking about the funeral, I had the 3 women, Eliza, Emily, from the past, Harmony from the present, and Misha from the future. I had them all kind of off stage talking and looking in at the funeral. 1915. Eliza Baxter never believed in rumors that the dead hung around the living for 3 days, occasionally attending their own funeral. Yet here she was, inspecting every detail from afar with detached scrutiny. Why, it didn't feel the least bit like haunting. "Seems like the whole town has come to see you off," said Amisha, flinging her long silver braid over her shoulder. But the newly deceased was too distracted with all the black coats and veils entering from the front door. And then it goes on. By late morning on the 3rd day, vast numbers of Federation club women had arrived from as far south as San Diego. They were inconsolable speaking of their leader's vision and inspiration, eloquence as a speaker and writer. They vowed to carry out the new structure of women's power she had introduced only so recently. The gift of this countrywoman will not be forgotten. But did anything change? Eliza's mood was decidedly dampened. Harmony lowered her eyes. It was an opportunity. Some ideas take years, decades, even centuries to come to fruition. And still, old ways run deep. Who'd have thought 100 years after emancipation, we'd still be struggling with attitudes left over from slavery? If you're a woman that perseveres, who knows? Women might now have a stronger voice in how things get done. Even with the rise of feminism and eco-consciousness in my time, the earth still suffers from man's greed for power and control. Well, do you really think one person can make a difference? Eliza asked. It happens all the time, Harmony said. Although it may not become apparent until much later, Amisha added. Well, when I sat at my desk, I simply knew what must be done, said Eliza. Okay, I've talked enough. Your turn, Heather.
Well, she was such a prolific woman, and she was so, she did so many wonderful things within the realm of agriculture, but it's really heartening and interesting to hear the mentorship that she did, especially for other women who were interested in getting involved in agriculture. So thank you so much for sharing that. I know you felt like it was long-winded, but it was great. So obviously you did a lot of research and you've gathered a lot of pieces of information in your quest for more information about Emily, but I was wondering if you ran across any little nuggets or interesting tidbits while you were looking at information.
I did. Yeah, there were a few surprises. One was, and I learned this from Virginia, her niece, who actually saw her, knew her, was how big she was, both literally and figuratively. We've kind of seen the figuratively big presence, but she was about 5'6" and almost 300 pounds. That's a big woman. And this picture on the right kind of alludes to that. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, she could really throw her weight around. The second thing that I thought was interesting that I didn't know before was that California came very close to having a UC Yolo campus instead of UC Davis, because UC Berkeley was looking for a farm for their new experimental agricultural campus. And they scoured the whole state looking for model farms that they could buy and turn into a campus. And they were very interested in the Hoppin farm in Yolo, and it was one of the last contenders. But in the end, the Davis farm won out because it was closer to the train station. And it also, the Davis family donated large amounts of land to UC. So could have had a UC Yolo campus, that would have been interesting. Then the other thing was the hidden years. The records will state facts and figures, lived here, did that, and so forth. And what the records say in the bios of both of Charles and Emily of 1913 and 1906 was that on the way to California, they lived in Fort McDermott, Nevada for almost 2 years. And that wasn't part of the story that Grandma ever told us. I had no idea that she never just that they went straight to California. But he was there to help his brother with his sheep herding and cattle business. And also, date-wise, in November 1875, while still living in Nevada, Emily gave birth to a son, Charles Frederick, who died in infancy. Now, I don't know if he died in Nevada. I assume he did. But we did a site visit to Winnemucca, and I searched all around for little graves of Hoppins and didn't find any graves, but we did find Hoppin Ranch, Hoppin Peak, and Hoppin Springs, just north of Winnemucca, below Fort McDermott. But this just kind of raises a lot of questions to me, because was this detour planned? Was it a last-minute decision? Emily had left all of her women connections, and she ended up in Fort McDermott, built to protect the settlers from Indians. And did she have any women friends there? Any support for pregnancy, birth, mourning her son who died? And I wonder who it was that decided it was time to go on to California. The other thing that I found was in writing Heartwood, it's fiction, and you can say anything in fiction, but I tried to be true to her presence and her spirit. But in the book, all the women were environmentalists. They were all concerned about what we were doing to the land in their own era, in their own time. But I knew Emily as a prohibitionist clubwoman and farmer. So I wrote her in anyway, that way. And then I found out that, by golly, she certainly was. And this article here from the Overland Monthly, on the bottom left, she talks about water. She talks about how water is the very foundation of California's prosperity. And so she talks about water. She also helped John Muir, like I said, prevent the dam at Hetch Hetchy. I mean, she was in the same room as him and voted, yes, let's support this man at a Federation meeting. So anyway, I found that she really was concerned about the environment. And on the right-hand column, it shows in this article that she was also an optimist and worked and hoped for world peace, which she said must be largely women's work. And you really agree with her on that. So those are some of the surprises that I came across.
Well, they're definitely surprising. I think the UC Yolo would have been interesting, but I do see why the train thing would be critical, and who wouldn't take advantage of free land. So I guess it makes sense. So my final question for you before we open it up to other questions from the attendees is, I was just curious, after all of this work that you did, researching and writing, and what was it about Emily's story that made you think she'd make a great fictionalized person for your book?
Okay. Yeah, that was kind of a surprise to me too, because that wasn't my original plan, as I kind of said. But fiction has the power to convey an emotional truth that facts do not. And as I started writing her biography, I knew that there was so much more to her than you could tell by dates and places and names and that kind of thing. And so I was able to, with fiction, I was able to get into her skin and be more able to convey her spirit and her presence in the world, not just a list of accomplishments. And by changing her name to Eliza, it helped me detach just enough that I wasn't like, oh, would Emily really said that? Or what would the family think? It really is a fictionalized version of her, but she inspired this character totally. And a lot of the events in the book actually happened. And I was able to share them in a way that you can hear on an emotional level. So in Heartwood, I wove all the three women's lives together, past, present, and future, and was able to make it about the collective power that women have to impact the earth and the future. And in the book, Heartwood begins with the ancient woman Shema'a's fear for the earth's demise and the words she sent forward to the women, which were, listen to the silence, hold the earth in your hands, gather the women, and then do what must be done. So in truth, I think Emily was an ordinary woman working together with other women to do really extraordinary, amazing things. And I think her name may only be briefly mentioned in history books. I mean, if you find her there, she's not like some of the other women that are sort of figureheads for movements, but she was part of the fabric that women wove together to get things done. And she was so much more than these accomplishments. She was an inspiration to others to work together to do what must be done, starting with protecting your home, family, and community, and then out into the world, protecting all forms of life, the rivers, the mountains, oceans, and the very air that we all inspire. So that's my story. And I really want to thank Heather and the Yolo County Archives and Library for this opportunity to kind of come full circle and share the research and Emily Hoppin that I've come to know. And if you're interested in reading more about her or going to the primary sources, you can go onto my website, which is shirleydickkard.com. And you can see I have over 30 documents and photographs posted, including over 20 of her speeches. And they're all under the tab Historical Research. And a lot of these will be available through the Yolo County Archives, and definitely her scrapbook will be. And I will have links to that from my website. And then if you want to read Heartwood, the book, you can check it out at the Yolo County Library, and the Yolo History Archives has a copy of it. And you can also purchase it at your local bookstore, your yay independent bookstores. The one in Davis called the Avid Reader, they're waiting for their shipment, and they will put in your reservation if you like, and they'll even mail it to you. But any independent bookstore will order the book for you if they don't have it in stock. So support our indie bookstores, and you can also buy it on Amazon, of course. So back to Heather, and I'll let you carry the rest of the program.
Well, thank you so much, Shirley. It's been great talking with you and learning about all of the wonderful resources that you have in your family and more about Emily Hoppin. And what really stuck with me in your last little bit that you were talking about is the collective power of women. And I think it's interesting that not only was that a thread through your book, but it was also a thread through Emily's life. I mean, she seems to not only mentor women, but be involved in these women's groups that helped to progress women's issues. And so I think it's very poignant that it's a thread through your book and also through her life. There's one question so far in the chat, and I should know the answer to this, but I don't. Is the Hoppin home still standing, do you know, in Yolo?
No, let's see. Shall I stop sharing? Is that puts me on the screen again? Or
sure, yeah, you could do that.
Okay, let's try that. Yeah, there we go. Okay,
perfect.
Yeah, no, and I actually have a sort of a hand-drawn map to the Hoppin site where it used to be, and I visited the location of the Hoppin ranch. And right now, and I think I have it on my website, I have a picture of it from 2011. You can see it's, I think there's a trailer there. Maybe there's an old barn, a lot of just stuff, fences and stuff. So there's, oh yeah, but there is the 2 palm trees that you can, it's kind of like a characteristic in the farm community. You plant 2 palm trees at the foot of your driveway. So if you look way across the fields, you can, the landscape, you can see that's where the farm is, where the 2 palm trees are. They're still standing. So it's not there. But if anybody wants to, I wanted to knock on their door, and I was just like afraid. So if anybody wants to help me go there, I'd be happy to.
Okay, that's the only question in the chat. I did have one question for you, Shirley, if you know the answer. Did any of the descendants of Emily and Charles take up the farming of the ranch after Emily passed?
Yeah, she divided her land into 4 because one of the sons had died. So there were four remaining children, and they divided up the land. And there is some old maps, 1915 and before, that shows Emily, and I have this on my website too. It shows Emily Hoppin as the landowner. It shows who owns each of the pieces of land. And I think there's one for Edith Hoppin and Emily Hoppin and a few other Hoppins. But they did continue farming the land. I don't know, maybe Miriam Berg or somebody else in the family knows. They eventually drifted off and sold the land, and I was put in touch with somebody who bought one of the pieces of land, and I wasn't able to make contact with them. So.
Yes, and the maps that Shirley's referring to are also at the archives, and you can see they've also been digitized and they're up online, so you can feel free to email me and I can shoot you some links if you want to look at those maps. And so now some questions are rolling in, Shirley. So where is Emily buried? Is she in the Woodland Cemetery?
Oh boy, yes. There is a big Hoppin plot. The old historic part of the cemetery, I believe, it's an old Hoppin plot that is I don't know, I'd probably say 20 Hoppin relatives in there. I don't know. But my story with that Hoppin plot is when my grandmother, Grandma Dot Dot, was in Oakland and I was in San Francisco, I would drive her to Sacramento to visit family. She would always gather flowers from her garden, and we would stop in Woodland, and we would stop at the family plot, and she would lay flowers on her mother's grave. And so now every time I come into Woodland, I try to leave some flowers on Emily Hoppin's grave. Dorothea is buried around the corner and down a ways. There wasn't room in the family plot, but that's where all the Hoppins are. And it's a very fascinating place.
And then that same person is asking, were there any Hoppins in the Capay Valley? She thought there might be somebody in the Capay Cemetery.
I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay.
Yeah, Elizabeth Monroe, Betsy Monroe, the Capay Valley person. So
yes.
we can get together and go hunting someday.
She's the one who's asking the question, so maybe she's seen something.
Well, could be. You know, let's go hunting. We'll take a trip.
Okay, and then it looks like there's one more question. How can we find the Hoppin Ranch?
The old Hoppin Ranch, I assume. Yes. Okay, I have the old map. It's not on my website. For some reason, the web designer didn't fit it in. And then I started thinking, oh, maybe, I don't know. I just felt funny about putting it up. I'd be happy to share it with anybody. I could send a PDF of it by email. You can contact me by my website, shirleydickkard.com, or by my email, which was also on that last page. And I'd be happy to email it to you, and certainly to the family members who might also want to be able to go visit it.
And then just a small plug from Barbara Graham. Shirley, it looks like you'll be portraying Emily at the Stroll in the Stroll Through History Cemetery this year, if it happens.
Yeah, I've been asked. I feel like I've got her in my skin now. It's like, you know, I could just reel off any speech. I will say that Miriam Berg was probably the original characterization of Emily. I think Miriam is in this in the audience. She was one who played Emily for a number of years, I believe. But she lives in Berkeley now, and so I guess I'm carrying the flag. And so that'll be fun. That'll be fun.
And the Stroll is the first Saturday in October, correct?
I think, was it October 12th?
I think so.
Or,
there's
I have it on my calendar. I don't know. It's on my calendar someplace.
I'm having one more. Let's do one more question if we've got some time. Looks like we've got a minute. So somebody is asking, aside from the butter and chickens, were there particular crops that Emily and Charles focused on growing? It's a great question.
Yeah. Well, he grew grapes. He grew a lot of very successful grapes. She had them all ripped out when he died because they were being made because of the wine connection, I guess, being made into alcohol or brandy or whatever, which I thought was interesting. A lot of fruit trees, and they grew barley, some wheat. They were always watching. They took the Eastern journals or Eastern farm journals, and they kept track of the wheat crops in Russia and Canada and around the world, so they would know how much to grow or not grow here in California. Almonds, walnuts for sure, I think almonds, but fruit trees, plums, prunes, things like that. Alfalfa, hay for the animal feed, things like that. And there was another story in the book of they put up the hay in the barn, and Emily told her sons were doing it at that point, and she said, it's too green, can't put it in. And they said, oh, no. So you know what happened. The barn caught fire, all of the year's hay for the animals burned. And as Grandma said, Emily was sitting there watching it, and her neighbors were all coming, people bringing their water buckets and everything, but the women were watching. And they said to Emily, oh, you must feel so sad, aren't you in tears? And she said, well, there's nothing I can do about it. May as well just have a visit with my friends I don't get to visit with very often. So she was a very practical woman, I think.
Yes, I think you'd have to be. Well, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you everybody who attended. It was great. And thank you again, Shirley. We so appreciate you taking the time to talk to all of us. And just so that I can put it out there, we are going to have this recorded and we'll put it up on the Yolo County Library's YouTube page when all said and done. And we'll send out something to let people know that it's up. We'll probably send something on the library's Facebook page, and we'll have the Friends of the Yolo County Archives send out an email when it's up and available. And I'm sure Shirley will share with her listserv as well. So thank you again. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and happy Women's History Month.
Yay. Yay. Thank you all for coming. It was, I appreciated being able to share. It was fun. Thank you, Heather.